Hello, everyone. I'm Carla Kopp. I'm a game designer, developer, publisher, and today I have the amazing Daniel Solis here to talk about rulebooks. He not only designed junk art and Kodama, and he's an art director, but he knows so many things. He's been on before, and he talked about cards and laying out all the things and graphic design. So he came back again because he is amazing. Do you want to introduce yourself again, Daniel?
Sure. Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm a graphic designer and art director in the board game industry. I've been working for about too long. I've been around for a minute. Just to clarify, I designed Junk Orbit, not Junk Art. Junk Art's fantastic. I wish I designed it, but I did not. So today I just kind of wanted to follow up on the last call with some answers and questions about rulebook layout and some of the nitty-gritty stuff that I go through. I'll have an InDesign file open that I'm going to screen share in a bit for a game that is about to come out from my day job at WizKids. And I'll go through all of the character styles and paragraph styles, and any questions you might have, I'll use that as a case study, mainly since it's already out. So I'm not going to be like revealing any big secrets in doing so. Happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
Okay, and if anyone does have questions, either ask them in the comments or you can use your voice if you feel like that too. But let's just get into it. Daniel, how many different styles do you normally have in a rule book? And by styles, I mean like you have your general rules format, important things to know, examples, etc.
Right. So just to clarify, in a technical sense, when I'm laying something out, there are a lot of paragraph styles. And by paragraph styles, that means what is a single block of text when it's just explaining rules? What does that look like? Usually it's pretty simple, pretty plain, very readable. But you also have usually several tiers of headers that you use to chunk out that information into more digestible bytes. And honestly, it's a little bit of wayfinding too, so that as you're browsing through the rule book, you see a header at the top of the page, you know generally what the topic of that page or the double page spread will be. If you start traversing from one topic to another across a page fold, usually that means I have to break that out into a separate header or move something around just so it breaks more cleanly. And usually I don't go further than 3 levels, ideally not more than 2. But sometimes it just has to happen. There's also styles for bulleted lists, numbered lists, sidebars, notes, callouts, all sorts of stuff. So just by way of example, I can start sharing what this looks like in InDesign. Let's see, if I present the entire screen. Okay. Can everybody see this InDesign file? I've got Super Skill Pinball 4K up.
Oh, I do not see it.
No?
Did you present now?
Okay. Got it. All right. Cool. Can you see that now? Just testing. Carla?
Yeah.
Can you see?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can see.
Okay. All right, cool. Just making sure. Let me organize this a little bit, because I am very messy when I'm working on stuff. Sorry. Sort by name. All right, so just starting at the top of the list here, going to the simple page spread. This gets very deep, so I'll just go over this very briefly and go over the very top line stuff. But you can see that I've got a paragraph style for body copy. I've got a version of that body style if it's on a dark background and I need to make the text white, and that's usually the only thing that's different about that. And then I subcategorize into bulleted lists and other types of lists that would be underneath, subordinate to the body copy. But I've also got paragraph styles for the captions and things like that. Let's go for some examples here. So say, for example, this has the caption paragraph style on it. And so say, for example, I've got this set up so that it is, this is a better example. this is a body copy paragraph, and if I just click on another paragraph style, you can see how things change. I can put it into I can make different attributes and just make different styles for those. And by just changing to these different styles, it's a very quick shorthand so that I can control a little bit of what happens here. But I feel like that's kind of getting into the weeds a little bit fast here. What I think would be more useful maybe is kind of going over the basic structure of a rule book that I typically follow, just as a quick overview. Usually, right up front, if the rules are pretty dense and there's not a lot of room to keep the rule book within a multiple of 8 pages, so 8, 16, math 36. I try to work within that multiple. I don't think you need to do that anymore. I think you can go down to multiples of 4 now, but it's an old habit from how I was trained. It's one I try to keep up. So if I see that there's more text than can fit in that amount of space, usually that means I'll move the introduction, the overview, a short list of components. All of that goes onto the front page, right up to the top. And that's just kind of how I do it. I don't mind it. Some folks would rather have a full page cover on a rule book, but it's sort of up to your preference. After the introduction and after the components list, then I go into the setup. In this case, this game has a very simple setup since it's a roll and write game. So that I had plenty of room to spread across the entire double page spread to show the entire gameplay area. You don't always have this amount of space available, especially if it's a big Euro game. But this happens to be a rather small size of a rule book in terms of its dimensions. So going double page spread gave me a little bit more room to show things in more detail. This is an unusual game because it actually comes with 4 different pinball tables. And so there's some basic rules that apply to all of them, but there's also secondary rules that are unique to that table in particular. With it being a pinball theme, every pinball machine has its own weird mini games and mechanics and stuff. So we didn't want to replicate like the entire main rules for every single table, and we didn't want to print 4 different rule books either. So we came up with a couple different organizational solutions that kind of made sense in this case. We began by just introducing the basic anatomy of what is on a pinball table that you'll see a lot. Where the score track is, what certain features on the boards are called, just as a give you a basic layout and lay of the land of what you'll be looking at. And then it goes into some details of play, going in particular through step 1, step 2, step 3. And you'll notice that in this case, for example, step 1 does not traverse into the next page. Every page begins with a new step so that when you're looking at this as one sort of unit of information, for example, like right off the bat, this is the amount of information that you'll be digesting at this particular time. Then you can move on to the next thing and digest the next piece of information. At least that's the idea. Whether that's successful all the time, it's matter of debate, but it's what I go for. And then this again goes into some more details. Then I usually close with what happens at the end of a turn, then what happens at the end of a round, and then what happens at the end of the game. That usually culminates in victory conditions. But in this case, this is a sort of a multiplayer solo sort of game. So the end game state was pretty brief. It didn't really go into much more detail about who wins. It's really just who has the most points on their particular table. But this is where we start transitioning into the more specific rules for each table. And this was a tough challenge because really the main rules are, as you may know from the page numbers, just 15 pages. But there's still like half a rule book left to go through here, and making all of the rules for every table very simple to digest before you start playing was tricky. But part of the way we did that was making the frames around the rule book, around the double page spread, different depending on which table you're looking at. So, in the main rules, it's this very straightforward, simple black border that kind of falls into the background a little bit. But then when we go into another table, we start having the fireworks of an amusement park and all the bokeh lighting features. But then when we go into another table that's more cyberpunk sci-fi, that's when we get more of these circuit boards, this binary code in the background, different color schemes, and that lasts about 4 pages. And then we go into the next table, which is fantasy themed, dragons in particular. So there's a lot of fire around. We go into some more fantasy stuff with spells and leveling up. And then it's disco, because, the ultimate level is always disco for some reason. I like it. And it's just flashing lights, the disco lights, the colored dance floor. And the goal here was that as you're flipping through the book and trying to figure out where you're ultimately going to land, that I want you to be able to browse through the rule book as quickly as possible to find the specific rules question or rules answer that you're looking for, and get back to playing. That's really the ultimate goal for any rule book. For me, is I organize it in such a way that it is as narrative in a way as possible, that you can start from the beginning and go cover to cover and then understand how to play by the end of the rule book, but also be organized and clearly labeled enough so that you can use it as a reference after you've already learned the game, so that when you're just looking at it in sort of without a particular order, just sort of randomly, you can always find this thing that you're looking for. It's hard, but that's the goal.
One of the things you mentioned is that you had the victory conditions like in the end game at the end. Is that what you prefer to have?
Yeah, and I might be anticipating a question you have, because a lot of advice tells you to put the goal of the game at the very beginning of the rule book as well, and that's totally fine. It's more about the framing of that, and this goes into a little bit of more text writing and editing. But yes, I do agree that in the beginning of the rule book, you should thematically explain what is your goal. So in say, for example, in Monopoly, just to take a classic example, your goal is to be the richest person and bankrupt all of your opponents. That's the narrative and story, and you can put that in the beginning of the rule book. But then at the end of the rule book, you could go into more granular detail about the details of currency exchanges and auctions and real estate and all that stuff. And that's kind of how I mean when I put the end game stuff at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that. So one thing in that rule book is that you had the pinball table, like the generic one, and then the steps. Do you typically like to explain like what's on the cards before you get to why it's important, or do you like to have it like in the middle, like, okay, this is why this is important and this is where it's at?
Yeah, that's usually a game by game call. Sometimes those anatomies of a cards can introduce game mechanics a little bit too early. That you start you start explaining this number means how much you spend when you draft a card to do this other thing. Like say you're playing Ascension, like a deck builder or something. That goes into too much detail, I feel like, if you're going to put it in front of the rules. If you're going to put it in front of the rules, the most I do is to just point at a thing, give it a name, so that when you go into the rules, when that name comes up again, you know exactly what that is referring to. I don't think it's the anatomy's place to explain the rules before you've explained the rules. That said, if you put that anatomy after the rules or in the middle of the rules, you can go into much more detail, elaborating on the individual items that you're calling out and giving some more context and detail there, especially if it's used towards the very, very end of the rule book as a quick reference. Say you're in the middle of playing a game and you need to find out, someone is asking you, what does this number mean again? You can just like turn to the back of the book on the back page and that'll be some info there.
So does like that answer change at all depending on the audience? Like a very gateway game or like even mainstream game versus a hobby game?
Yeah, I think so. What I would consider a gateway game, like something that's very mass market, would likely not need an anatomy section as much. So that's kind of a different call. If there is a game that's a little bit more, honestly, the games that are coming out in Target and Barnes and Noble now are much more complicated than they would have been 15 years ago. So yeah, there is sometimes a call for it. Presenting that kind of information is tricky for a mass market audience. It's easy to overwhelm very, very new players that have never played a board game before or have very limited experience. The threshold for like, I'm ready to have fun and this looks complicated is like a millimeter. If you say one extra word, then they're out. So it's a tenuous position, and ultimately, while a rule book is useful, and I try to make my rule books as useful as possible, it's only one tool in an entire kit that I think will get a new player on at the table ready to play. That includes the other players who actually already know how to play the game, who have experience with other games. That includes videos, even reviews. There's a sort of a folk infrastructure around learning games that is much older than the existence of rule books themselves. The rule books are a relatively recent addition to that learning a game experience. That said, still, I try to make my rule books serve that experience as much as possible by giving the person who's teaching the game as many tools as possible, even if the person who is having to learn from the rule book may be a little bit slower in onboarding. Yeah, I ramble. My apologies. Please cut me off if you find that I am doing so.
No, I love it because like I didn't realize that rule books were like a newer addition to gameplay. I like learning new things.
Well, I'm thinking of big time scales. I'm thinking like chess and like Go
yeah.
and stuff.
Yeah, because like I feel like I bought a chess or a checkers set, and I don't feel like there was rules to it. Like maybe they just assume that there's like if you're buying this thing, you already know how to play.
It's not uncommon.
Kathleen had a question. How can creating a rule book make a game design better?
Oh boy. Having had experience designing games and also designing rule books for games for myself and for other people. What I find generally is that, say for example, if teaching a rule takes a paragraph that is yay big, and the amount of fun units that comes out of that paragraph is less than what this density of a paragraph really warrants, then that means usually that the rule needs to be modified so that it's that's like half that size. And ultimately, I'm just trying to convert text into fun units and to make it as an efficient conversion as possible. And so I can't call myself an editor, but I have had some editing tasks and experience in the process of laying out a game. Say for example, if as I said, I try to fit a topic into a one-page spread or one page, and if over time the client says like, okay, can we add another paragraph to this? Can we add another paragraph to this? And it starts like getting interrupting the flow a little bit, like moving a topic further and further back, or making one topic last much longer than another topic would if it breaks the rhythm. Usually that's when I'll say, maybe you should reconsider this rule, or if not, perhaps this goes into more detail than is appropriate at this point when you're in the rules. Perhaps that needs to go into a whole subsection of its own later on in the rule book after you've gone over the basic steps of play. And in that process of just laying out the text, I've gotten into the habit of anticipating problematic mechanics. If I see that scoring an endgame thing takes a certain amount of algebra to resolve, when other endgame scoring elements don't take that amount of overhead, that is when I'll be like, maybe I should remove the algebra. Maybe I'll keep the other thing. Maybe I'll cut that paragraph. And I think over time, 10, 15 years of doing this, you get less precious about those individual mechanics. You start looking at the big picture of how the whole game functions as a whole.
Oh, so I love your idea of like rule to fun units. I found this out like a couple times before where I was like, this rule is like, it's so important to make sure that like players are equal and stuff. But like if you have like, I don't know, half of a page just trying to equal it all out, like and people have to read it and understand it each time they play, then just take it out and do something simpler. Everyone will enjoy it so much more. Like, even if it's not like completely balanced that way, I mean, saving 5 minutes of your life every time you play.
Yeah, I just think if you're the designer and it's taking you a while to process it, it's going to take someone who's fresh to this game much longer.
Joel had a question. Do you think it's important to include potential strategies in a rule book?
So I have a pretty hot take on this. I agree. I think yes, strategies should be included in most rule books, especially if they are over 30 minutes. Like that's my take. Is like for every half hour of play you expect a typical session to be, the game should have that much more strategic guidelines, especially for your beginner player. And even going so far as to say, if this is your first time playing, you make this recommendation for a particular faction to play. If this is a multi-faction sort of game, this type of thing is important. A lot of folks miss it the first time they play. Keep an eye on it. Say, for example, managing your resources so you don't run out and suddenly your whole engine stalls out for like 3 or 4 turns while everyone else's engines are just revving up. Like that kind of thing will kill anyone's interest in a game the first time they play it, and they won't come back to that game, and they'll never see the cool heart that you've really designed into that game because they're just bounced off of it. I've had some pushback on that. A lot of folks will say it's almost like a spoiler to reveal a strategy for a game in that way. And I get where they're coming from, because for them, the joy that they experience in gameplay isn't that sense of discovery where they solve the puzzle themselves. And to them, I just say that's fine. I think there are ways you can accommodate both types of player by just setting aside the strategic tips to a separate part of the rule book and not interleaving them with the main flow of the rules. If someone wants to kind of find their way through the forest and figure out their own strategies, that's totally cool. But I want to respect a player's time because they're my customer. And if I'm putting hours and hours over many months on a product that they're going to bounce off of in one bad night, then my work has been wasted. So I'm going to do everything I can to onboard as many people as cleanly and as simply as possible, so that everyone is on the same page. That's just sort of my take.
Yeah, I definitely agree, because there's definitely there's games that I've played, like Rococo comes to mind, where that game I feel like we played for like 2 or 3 hours, and like I figured out what I should have been doing, like, I don't know, an hour in, and then I lost by a lot. But if I had like been given like just even training wheels, or pay attention to this, or I think Root does it really well, where they have like a starting scenario where they recommend that. Just things like that, where maybe they don't tell you everything you should do, but like maybe if you've never played, like what your first turn might look like.
It's a balancing act, because if you find that there are, say, dominant strategies, then that's a more fundamental thing where you have to revise the design a little bit just to clear that up. But it's not a perfect solution to any of this, but ultimately my goal is to just get as many people having fun at the table as possible, as quickly as possible. And if there's a learning curve that is stopping that from happening, I want to lower that curve as much as I can.
Mm-hmm. Adam had a question. He thought that the text in the fun units is interesting. Are you okay sacrificing full rules clarity to maximize the fun units, or is full rules clarity more important? We had an example of a tile laying game with the words place anywhere. It's very intuitive and high with fun units, but if somebody places a tile on their head, it's not productive.
Yeah, the whole step 1 of setup, put board on table. Like that's a tricky one. It's easy to get pedantic in games text. It's the whole the old story about teaching someone to make a peanut butter sandwich that begins with every single step, meaning like open the refrigerator door, take the bread out of the fridge. spread peanut butter on the bread. Oh no, you forgot to take the bread out of the package of the of the thing. So it's easy to get very, very, very granular to the point where it just makes the whole thing seem cumbersome. And in the worst case scenario, it bloats the rule book size to an extent that the rule book looks like it's more intimidating than the game actually is. And I think the best example of this is actually on April Fool's Day. Rodney Smith on Watch It Played, he did a tutorial for Monopoly. And it took him about 20 minutes or more. And this is a game that supposedly everyone knows how to play. And this is a guy who's probably the best rules teacher in the business, doing it professionally for a long time. And if it takes him 20 minutes to teach Monopoly, then I think that's a sign that what we consider simple is perhaps a little bit more complicated than it would let on once you break it down into its individual like units. But to the question at hand, whether you can sacrifice rules clarity for the sake of fun, I think for a game that has less of a competitive tactical edge to it, where you're not going to have rules lawyers really nitpicking a lot of this stuff, if the spirit of the game that is introduced based on the theme, the name of the game, how it's marketed, the age range that you're talking about, if all of those things establish a sense of a social contract that we're not going to just, we may make a joke here and there, I'm going to put it on my head, but at the same time, if everyone kind of gets what the intent of the rules are, then yeah, you can keep that text pretty simple. The further afield you get from familiarity, the more unusual your mechanic, the more unusual your components, the more unusual your theme, even. That is where you can afford to be a little bit more specific. And that's where, say, for example, in Hanabi, where you hold your cards backwards, so you only see the backs, but everyone else can see the fronts. That's a rule that a lot of people really have trouble remembering. It's fairly simple to say, but a lot of the rules teach in that game is based on establishing why that's important and why the whole game breaks down if you break that rule by accident, if you cheat by accident on that. That's the entire game. I'm bad at giving clear answers, but hopefully that answers something.
Yeah, I definitely think it does, especially with the specific example. Like if you do anything that's really weird or like that other people haven't seen, like go into depth about why like it's exactly like this. Because I've seen other people do that to my rules, like when I'm in the playtesting phase, where they're like, oh, okay, so this is how it read, but I knew you really meant it this other way. But if I had like an example or something after it, like really like pushing that, no, my words are exactly what I mean, then those people don't make that like assumption that I wrote it wrong.
Oh yeah, visual examples are absolutely like the thing I spend the most time on. I'm working on a new edition of the game Clash of Cultures. It came out from Z-Man many years ago. It's going to be coming out from WizKids, and I'm working on the rulebook for that right now. And that is a game that has, if you've played Civ games before that have a lot of like what I call pushy stick, like old Napoleonic war game kind of feel to it. It's not like that. It's not that kind of game, but it's dudes on a map. It's literally dudes and buildings on a map, and you're like building up civilizations and stuff. And there are a lot of interactions of different rules that could trip up even an experienced player. So we're packing that thing with tons of examples, lots of visuals, and spacing it out so that the rule book is a little bit larger. I think it's like 36 pages at this point, and it's probably not going to get larger than that. But I wouldn't put a 36-page rule book into a mass market target game. That thing would just a thud on the table, and no one would want to play it. But the market for this game, especially if they played the first edition, would tolerate that much more easily. They probably take a 40-page rule book too. But again, I want to respect their time. So I'm trying to keep that page count minimal, but at the same time, establish a good structure and rhythm with plenty of examples and visuals to guide people through their first time this edition of the game. If it's their first time playing that, if it's their first time playing, or if it's the first time since the first edition. I want to get everybody on board as quickly as possible.
How would you determine when you're going to put in a visual example?
Usually I put an example if there's some detail about how one component moves from one zone to another. And that can be as simple as a zone being your hand, an opponent's hand, a tableau that's in front of you, the central game board, like a drafting pool. All of those I call zones. And so whenever something moves from one zone to another, I typically use a visual example there showing that card with an arrow moving towards a discard pile or something like that. It's rare that I have to go into that much detail for a card game, but in the case of Clash of Cultures, there are multiple steps of movement, for example, across a map on a hex grid, where it's very important that that we establish the basic rules of what range is, how far a unit can move from one place to another. If a land unit gets onto a boat and then moves across water and then lands there, I break down every one of those steps. And I wish I could show you what I'm doing there. It's probably too early to show, but yeah, basically, what I actually look at, there's a book that I would recommend that anyone who's getting into this business read. And it's an oldie but goodie, and a lot of people have probably read it already, but it's called Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. And it's really about comics and the language of sequential art, how you show movement and three-dimensional space and time on a static medium, like a page, a piece of paper. And there are some intuitive things that are in that that are in the language of comics that we've sort of absorbed over many years of being exposed to comics, even if you haven't read them. But they're, when you look at them with fresh eyes, you realize, wait, why do we depict sound coming out in these weird bubbles coming out of their mouths? Why is it that when we show sound effects, there are these big jagged lines and letters that show this? Like, there's some conventions to this that we take for granted that really get analyzed there. But what's most important for rule book designers from that text is showing the passage of time over several panels. So if I have to break down the steps of a single action in a game, usually what that means is if a designer gives me a paragraph and every sentence within that paragraph is a step of doing an action, usually I'll make each of those sentences its own paragraph and then space it out with an image showing what is going on in that sentence as an example. And this does pad out the rules quite a bit, but at the same time, it leaves much less doubt about what the intent of the words are when you actually see it moving. So say, for example, if the steps of play for Ascension, for example, are that you have a hand of cards, and you can spend the currency to take one of the treasures from the central pool. Then I would break down that step in showing a hand of cards. I would highlight all of the monies that you have on that hand of cards, point to the available things that are in the tableau that you could possibly afford, and go through the steps of like, okay, put down the monies, discard those, take the things from the tableau, put those into your discard pile. Like, really break it down. I don't recall exactly how they depict it in the Ascension rulebook, but these are things I think if you played a lot of deck building games, that comes naturally to you at this point, and so you don't need to go into that much detail. But imagine if you're someone who's just coming into the hobby and you have Ascension in front of you, and you have all this information, the numbers, the icons, and all this stuff. I want to be sympathetic to that player, even if it means that the experienced player feels like, I don't need to know all this. Like, that this is for the newbie. Like, I want to get them to the point where they scoff at how much information I'm trying to elaborate on. I want to get everybody to the scoff level, because perhaps that's a misguided goal, but yeah, I feel strongly that if we're going to keep this hobby growing and lasting, that we need new people in it, and the best way to do that is to not make them feel like they're completely in out of their depth.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Would you ever suggest for a game to have like two rule books, like one for people that are brand new and one for people that know like what set collection is?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, we did do that in the pinball game. As you saw, that rule book is fairly substantial, and if you're coming into this with having played just pinball, and you're like pick up this box and you're like, oh, well, I can't go to an arcade right now for obvious reasons. So I want to get the somewhat similar experience on a table. It's a solo game, so it works for that. But you've had no experience with board games, and certainly roll and write games may not be as familiar to you. We do include a quick start one-page thing. It's at the top of the stack of components. When you open the box, the first thing you see is a one-page quick start thing that goes into some detail about what this game is, what your goal is, what are the individual bits that you're looking at, and I believe that's actually online either from the WizKids website or on Board Game Geek right now. We also released a print and play version of the first table in the series, so that players could kind of get the lay of the land for how the game plays, and we're hoping that by doing that, by releasing a print and play, by putting a quick start on the top of the box, on top of the contents of the box, that we foster that folk experience that I talked about earlier, where it seems like other folks know how to play this game and they can teach me. So when you learn chess, you probably learn from somebody else. You probably didn't learn from a rulebook. If you learn checkers, you probably learned it from your parents or a friend or a peer. And we want to sort of establish that at least a little bit of the beginnings of that base of knowledge that say Magic the Gathering enjoys right now, where there are tutorials online for it, but most people who play the game now have probably learned from friends or family that taught them the game at some point. We're trying to get to that point as quickly as we can, and it's hard. Not every game can do it, but it's not a bad goal to pursue.
I really like that idea. I've been doing like quick start setup for a while, where like it's on the back and it's like, oh, okay, just read this setup and you probably know what to go from there. But I really like the idea of also having like what the goal is and like some more information. So then, like if you are just good at games and you know things, you can just do that. Well, like not good, but like there's sometimes like where I'm like, yes, I understand how like trick taking works. Like let's get to the game.
Yeah, I can show you what this quick start looks like if you like. If you'll give me a minute here, let me try to start this again. Hopefully, it'll be faster this time. Then, okay, can you see that quick start?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is not as flashy as the rulebook. It doesn't have as many graphics and stuff. But that's not really the point of this document. It's really to break down as quickly as possible what a game in progress looks like. So you show that entire game in progress on the top right corner there. Show all the components that you'll need for gameplay. The goal here is like 2 lines, 2 sentences. Just compete against your friends or play solo. Either way, your goal is to score as many points as possible. Then one little small section here on setting up the game. I can zoom in a little bit if that helps. And that just goes into some very, very cursory detail about what you'll need, what happens at the beginning of the game, where your ball starts when you start playing the game. And all of those steps that I described in the rule book, where each page or each double page spread was a separate step, I've consolidated that all down into one paragraph, with the acknowledgement that this is not a complete and thorough, comprehensive explanation of the game. This is just this is real quick start stuff, and it's as much a teaching guide as it is a reference for the experienced player. And that entire column, how to play, step 1, step 2, step 3, end of round, end of game, that is less than half a page. It's about a half of a column of a page to go over the entire set of rules. The remainder of this is an explanation of what the different zones are for the first table, and what those areas mean, what the mechanics are around those, what they're called, for instance. And then this goes into the special features that are unique to that table in particular. And that goes into a little bit more detail with what skill shots are, different mechanics, nudging, tilting. Those are things that make it so that it's a little bit easier to process as you go deeper into the game. And once you've learned all that, then we just have a little call to action at the end that, if you're ready for more, then there's 3 more tables that you can play through if you like. And hopefully, we'll see. This is going to be hitting the market pretty soon here. Hopefully, this experience gets people onboarded a little bit more quickly than if they were to try to process that entire rule book all at once. We're doing a lot of interesting stuff here to try to make that experience as fun as possible.
Are you doing anything else interesting and different?
For this game in particular, we've got a lot more involvement with the designer. I think he made his own YouTube video explaining the whole thing. He's going to be on a couple different streams where they'll be playing remotely, and that's kind of a lucky break for us at this point that this is a game that can be played remotely fairly easily. But that's roll and writes in general. Typically, those are fairly easy to play remotely anyway. So that's kind of why we're putting so much support behind this game in particular. It's also Jeff Engelstein. He knows his stuff. He's the host of Ludology. He's no slouch when it comes to designing games. So that makes it easy too. that we know for sure. Hey, this game is good. You should try it. It's gonna be easy. Yeah.
So you mentioned the Understanding Comics book. Do you have any other resources that are like that are just really good if you want to learn how to do rule books better, or just layouts or things like that?
Yeah. Oddly enough, there's not that much that would be specifically useful for that. It's a lot of very broad. Understanding comics is probably the biggest one that I think back to and use the lessons of as much as I do. Aside from that, some basics of typography are very useful, and thankfully you don't need a textbook for that. You don't really need anything that's going to set you back $50 to $100 for an expensive book. The basics of typography have been established for hundreds of years, and you can look up online how to just look up basics of typography, and you'll see a lot of instructions on grid systems, and that's an important key term, I think, to look up grid systems. And what grid systems are is if you take a page and you break it up into smaller units, smaller cells on a grid, there are certain axes that I think we talked about this on the last call, actually, because I do this on cards as well, where on the left axis, for example, if you have all of your text start on one axis, that makes it easier for your eye to come back to that point, scanning that page, knowing that the next line will always begin at that same margin. Some folks will break that a little bit in order to do sidebars or things like that. But that's the kind of stuff where, okay. So, all right. So I don't have a book, but some key terms to look up. Grid systems, like I said, typographic hierarchy. If you're gonna search for anything, that's a topic to look up, because I think it's important that whether you're designing books, cards, pages, covers, posters, sell sheets, if you're trying to pitch this to a company, all that stuff. Establishing what is the most important thing on the page, what is subordinate to that, is an extremely useful skill that I think is really fundamental to any type of layout. And the one lesson that I have drilled into me, and I hear it every day from my professors back in the day, was if everything is important, nothing is important. So it's really key that if you say something is important on a page, make that the most important thing, and don't do anything else that distracts from it. So keep things simple, or keep it clear, keep it organized. If you break out of a grid and break out of that system, make sure it's for a reason, because it's going to draw attention to itself. So that becomes the thing that draws the eye. I really wish I had a book for you. My apologies. So much of what I learned was on the job, to be honest, over many, many years of trial and error. I had some less good rule books back in the day that I look back on and I cringe, but it's also the process of learning And I know that in 10 years, if I look back on a rule book that I have now, I'm sure I'll be like, oh, why did I do that? Why did I split up these tables into different sections? Like, I'm sure I'll be thinking something like that at some point. But for now, it's kind of my process.
Well, I hope you do write a book at some point, and then you also define all where like the regions are and what their names, so that we can just get a basis of knowledge.
Oh, and if you want an encyclopedia, I think Jeff Engelstein has and Isaac Shaleb with building blocks of game design or building blocks of look for building blocks of game design. I think it's something like that. I designed the diagrams for this thing. I should know the title of it. My apologies, Jeff and Isaac, if you're watching this. But yeah, oh yeah, shoot, I have a copy somewhere. But anyway, building blocks. Yes, if you want definitions of things, they make a noble effort to define mechanics, and in the process of doing so, they often define the zones of play as well. There's no hard and fast definitions of these sorts of things, nor is that book designed to be comprehensive and prescriptive in any way. Building blocks of tabletop game design. Thank you. Yes, that's a very useful book, I find. Pick it up if you can.
Okay, Adam had another question. Thoughts on the best approach to digital, physical, hybrid approach to rule books? For example, adding a patch notes section that you can populate digitally later, adding a video link to how to play, populating the digital rulebook with hyperlinks to common mechanics that you might not fully explain.
Yeah. The strength of print is that it's very durable. It's not going to go down when the electricity is off. It's not going to. You don't need any other additional apps or interfaces for it. Its weakness is that it doesn't update. It's not live, and there's nothing goes to print. No book, no rule book, no nothing that doesn't have some typo or error in it. And all the editing teams in the world wouldn't have caught those typos. It's a shame that every rule book is going to have errata in it, but we try to keep it down as much as possible, of course, for quality assurances and out of respect to the players. If you do have to plan ahead for errata, then I think there's a couple ways you can do it. One I've seen a lot of is QR codes, which are cool. QR codes linking to either videos or to websites that forum threads. If you have a subreddit or a page on Board Game Geek, wherever you want to channel your FAQs to, that's not a bad place to. It's not a bad way to link to that through print. That said, I personally try to keep it simple. I try to keep a URL there so that you don't have to use your camera or phone to go to it. As long as the URL is clean and easy to read, of course. As far as app integration goes, I like the idea that if there was a role-playing game, I can't recall the title of it right now, but there's a role-playing game that was published as an ebook where if you tapped on a paragraph, it flipped as if it was a card and showed an example of play with diagrams and movement showing how that works. I can't recall the title of that RPG, but someone might have seen it. It might have only been a tech demo, honestly. But that was a cool idea. That said, granted, I'm biased. I like print. I rely on print a lot whenever I'm playing a game or teaching a game. Video and digital tutorials have the advantage of all the feedback that you can get and the constraints that they impose. That if you're doing a digital tutorial, there are things that you can stop a player from doing entirely, depending on how integrated that the digital side of things is to the game. There's one solution to this that I quite like that was in Crossmaster Arena and in the most recent Gloomhaven expansion, Jaws of the Lion. Both of those present their gameplay in the form of their rulebook, that you flip a page, it establishes a map, shows you the components that you'll need to play through that scenario. You put the pieces onto the page of the book and you play out that experience there. Then you turn the page. And in that way, there's no digital aspect to that per se, but I think it takes a lesson from digital tutorials and walkthroughs in a digital space because it completely defines the available game space. It doesn't introduce any mechanics, components, or literal playing area that you can't interact with before you're ready for it. So, yeah, wish I had a clearer answer. I can't say I have much personal experience with integrating apps, but I think some folks on the forefront of this, taking lessons from apps and digital, are things like that.
I really like that the whole idea of like you have the book and everything that you need is right in front of you, so don't worry about all the rest of it because that'll come later. And I also agree about the digital. Like I usually in my rule books have like a link, and I can edit that link to be whatever I want. Like if I really need to do an errata, I could have it like go and be on a page like that. Usually it's just like learn to play video, but you can make a link go anywhere, go to a series of links if you really want lots of things. Matt had a question. How important do you feel color choice and font sizes are to make an accessible and understanding rulebook?
Oh, paramount. Font sizes are kind of the backbone of any kind of clarity. But font sizes and color, it's not so much the color as the contrast. Is that text easy to read against its background? So if it's blue on a light blue background, that's going to be harder to read. If it's blue on a white background, that'll be easy to read. If it's, depending on the shade, if it's blue on a black background, that could be easy to read too. But I like to think of zebras. I would hesitate to put a title graphic or text onto a picture of zebras because there's a lot of texture and stripes going on that could intersect with the letter forms and perhaps make an H look like an N or a G completely obscured entirely. And that is really what I'm looking for. I think of, perhaps this is odd, but I think of letters as shadows. And if there's something casting a shadow behind that shadow, it changes the ultimate silhouette. Like if you're doing bunny ears being projected onto a screen, and someone else comes in with like little bunny ears that comes out, and it changes the shape a little bit, you've lost the shape. And so that's really how I look at letters, and that's why I'm so perhaps a little bit adamant about keeping my backgrounds as clean and simple as possible. So all that said, color is important, yes. Size is important, definitely. But really what you want to look at is contrast. How clear is that text against your background?
Okay. Yeah, the contrast is very important. For font size, what would you say like the smallest font you would go on a card that would be in your hand?
Okay, so yeah, that's a good constraint that you've established there, because it does matter how far away the object is when you're laying out text. If it's, as you say, on a card in your hand, and it's rare that you'd have to look at it from a distance, and assuming that it's a standard font, something that's not like really weird and grungy or what have you, you could go as small as 8-point. With maybe 13 points of leading, that is 13 points of line spacing. But you could go tighter than that in some cases if the font is, there are some sans serif fonts that can sustain smaller sizes without much harm. This goes into some gritty detail, but there's a thing called X height in typography. X height is the height of the lowercase x in that font. And some fonts, they have very, very tiny X heights, but they're ascenders, the parts that stick out and up, or descenders, that parts that stick down, like a Y or an H, a lowercase h, that is. There's high variance there. That means that if you were to set that font at 8-point, you would barely be able to read the letters, because all you're seeing is these lines and tiny, tiny little counter spaces on the B's and the D's and stuff. But other fonts like Helvetica have been designed so that the X heights are fairly large relative to the size of the ascenders and descenders. And that's why they can survive being set at smaller sizes, even fine print on a contract, for example. That's why they can still be readable at those small scales. You probably wouldn't do that with a serif font that has some decorative elements, some thick and thin variants in the strokes. Yeah, sorry, I go into the weeds on typography stuff, but my apologies. But yeah, 8 point, call it 13, 12 points of leading, and that'll carry you even if it's a sans serif or serif font. If you go smaller than that, go sans serif. If you go bigger than that, you could probably get a little more flexible.
So how do you feel about different sections in the rulebook, like having an FAQ and a table of contents?
If it's a longer rule book, then I do recommend a table of contents. And in particular, when you're setting up your PDF, I recommend making that table of contents live linked, so that if someone's looking at the rule book on their phone or online, making that table of contents actually linked directly to the section. So you just click on that header and then go directly to that section of the rule book. And also making all of your cross references live is a big help. But yeah, I'm fine with a table of contents. An FAQ, ideally, in a perfect world, you wouldn't need an FAQ. The game would be well designed enough, and the rules would be presented well enough that there wouldn't be any more FAQs. That's probably not going to happen. There's always going to be Qs, and you're going to have to be the A to those Qs. So yeah, it's I'm fine with an FAQ if it's no more than a double page spread. 2 pages should cover you with any extenuating circumstances, little small interactions. Oftentimes I just use if I use an FAQ, I had one in Junk Orbit actually, there was an FAQ there. That was mainly a place that I literally repeated some of the rules that had been established already, because there's some, the movement in that game is based on orbital mechanics. Moving from one planet to another, following the gravity wells of different planets. So it's a little bit tricky knowing that you have to change from clockwise to counterclockwise as you go from one planet to another, following that trajectory. Seeing it in person, it makes sense. Like you kind of understand naturally, but putting that in text was difficult. And so though I explained it and they put diagrams into the rulebook, I still had an FAQ, an explanation of there's no U-turns when you're going from one planet to another. Little things like that. And in that FAQ, I peppered in some jokes and some thematic explanations of why, for example, so what happens when you run out of cargo or run out of fuel? I explained, okay, so that means you don't have enough fuel to move. That means you've lost that. You haven't lost the turn, but you just pick up the fuel from wherever you are, and your crew is very mad at you. It's little things like that. I don't go into too much detail about it, but it's that little tiny joke that I fit into the FAQ to help support the rule that makes it easier to remember. That keeps the rule sticky. That's the kind of thing where I think an FAQ would be useful.
I think I've always been against FAQs, but if you do it like you just said and have thematic reasons and little extras like that, I think it could definitely be fun. Matt had another question. Given a rulebook for a classic game such as Scrabble or Avalon's Hill's Third Reich, if given the job to redesign, what are the first few things you would do or change?
If it's an older game, I would review the FAQ section on Board Game Geek for that game. Find out what are the most common questions that people have. Where are people getting hung up? What are things that the experienced players take for granted that are not intuitive to the new players? And try to address those as clearly and patiently as you can. Don't take anything for granted. It's easy for a player to feel like they're out of their element, and you don't want that in a game. You're here to have fun, and so making sure that if someone has a question or they don't entirely understand a rule, take the time to teach them in the rule book and to organize the text of it so that you have the space to do so. Make sure you have enough room for examples, multiple examples if necessary, and make it clear what are the things that are allowed and what are things that are not allowed based on the rules that you've just explained. Make sure that topic is as clearly and thoroughly explained as possible before you move on to the next one. And you're probably still going to have FAQs after all that, but at least you put in your honest effort and you've come at it with honorable intent.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly great. Like, I sometimes forget that BGG has like so many people asking all these different questions. So it's something to keep in mind for sure, even if you're just doing a reprint. We had another question from Adam. It'll be our last one. Okay. Could you share the top 3 bits of process improvement advice for a casual InDesign user?
Ooh, casual. Okay. First off, establish a workplace. There's a function in InDesign under Window Workspace, and there's a bunch of different options for workspaces, is what they call. Basically, it's an arrangement of all the panels and tools that Adobe recommends for different purposes, whether you're digital publishing or making an interactive PDF. Whatever you like, establish that as your workspace and save it so that you can always default back to that. And I find it speeds up your entire process when you become familiar with where your tools are at all times. And it may not be what Adobe thinks you need, but if it's what you need, establish that. Also, before you open up any documents in InDesign, make sure that you have set your the units of measurement, all the other preferences that you have, set those before you've opened up a document. And if you do that, then any new document that you open will have those preferences. So if you find that things are defaulting to imperial units when you want them to default to metric or vice versa, it's because you have to set your preferences before you open a document. And then thereafter, any new documents that you open should have those preferences. And then lastly, familiarize yourself with paragraph styles and the difference between those and character styles. You'll find tutorials for this, thankfully, straight from Adobe, and also many people on YouTube who can give you some basic guidelines on how those individually work. But it's going to save you so much time as I showed at the beginning of this interview, it's going to save you so much time by establishing the basic formats of different paragraph styles, different ways of presenting information into these very quick little packages that you can turn on and off. So yeah, just to recap, set up your workspace, set up your preferences, and learn styles.
Yeah, I can definitely second the whole learn styles thing, because I had a time where I thought I knew what character styles and paragraph styles meant, and then I ruined everything, and I had to go back and spend hours just switching things from character styles to paragraph styles, because that's what I actually wanted.
Yeah, it is the most common thing I see from when I'm opening up a file from someone who has just started. It's extremely common. Don't feel bad about it, but your life is going to get a lot better when you figure out what the difference is between those two.
Oh yeah, like I'm still like a very beginner, but I know that now. So Daniel, if people want to get to find you after this, where should they go?
Sure. I'll have a Patreon where I answer folks' questions on graphic design and layout. You can find that at patreon.com/Daniel Solis. That's DANIELSOLIS. And I'm also at Twitter at Daniel Solis. Same name.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being here, and thank you all for watching. If you want to continue the conversation, we have a Discord at weirddraftgames.com/Discord. But we'll see you again next Sunday at 2 p.m. Central. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Bye.